Picking up a camera for the first time can be intimidating. There's a lot of different settings and buttons and dials that you may have never seen before. It can be very tempting to put your camera into auto mode and go out and shoot everything on auto. Now, that's great, but most of the times your camera's just guessing at the right settings and you're not going to get the results that you want. Today I'm going to cover the three primary settings that make up the exposure triangle. That's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO or ISO. Understanding these three settings and how they affect your image are going to allow you to get the proper exposure every single time you click that shutter button. So sit back, flip that camera into manual mode, and let's get started. The first setting I want to talk about is aperture. Now, it's somewhat important to call out that aperture is really the only setting in the exposure triangle that is primarily affected by the lens that's on your camera. I'll get a little bit more into that later. Think of aperture like the pupil of your eye. The more light that hits your eye, the more your pupil dilates and less light gets into your eye. The same goes for a camera's lens. Now, aperture affects the blades within your camera's lens, and they open and close the more you change the setting. To better understand how to control this, it's important to understand that aperture is measured in f-stops. So some lenses can get down to f1.4 or f1.2 and go all the way up to f22. A bigger f-stop number will give you a smaller aperture within your lens. So the blades close and it allows less light to hit your camera's sensor. So that will result in a darker image. The opposite is true for a smaller f-stop, which gives you a larger hole with the blades in your lens, so more light comes in, more light hits your light sensor, and it's a brighter image. From a visual perspective, aperture is what controls your depth of field, which at its core is basically how blurry your background is. To explain this a little further, if you imagine looking at an image on its side, the point at which your camera is focused is called the focal point, and your aperture setting controls the depth of field, which is how much in front of and behind your focal point is going to be in focus within that image. Now, a large aperture or a smaller f-stop number is going to allow more light into your camera and create those really creamy, blurry backgrounds that so many photographers are after. This is great for a portrait photographer. On the flip side, a small aperture or a large f-stop number is what's going to allow more light into your image and more is going to be in focus from front to back. This is great for landscape photographers who are trying to get an entire scene in focus and really have that crisp image. Now, in photographer lingo, a lot of times you'll hear if you're shooting wide open, that is with a very small aperture number, and they call it wide open because your lens is wide open, letting in the most amount of light. If you're stopped all the way down, that's a very high aperture number, and it's a very small amount of light getting in because the aperture blades are really close. The next setting to talk about on the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is important because your camera has a mechanism, what's called a shutter, and that opens and closes to expose your camera's sensor to light, which allows you to take an image. Now, the best way to actually represent a shutter is similar to that of a garage. A garage door opens, car goes in, garage door closes. Same for the shutter mechanism. Shutter opens, light comes in, shutter closes. This shutter mechanism controls the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light, so shutter speed is measured in time. In your camera settings, you'll see 1 second, 1/30, 1/100, even 1/1000 and more. From a visual perspective, shutter speed is important because it controls the amount of motion blur or lack thereof in your image. A very fast shutter speed, like 1/1000, will stop all motion blur in your image, essentially freezing time in an instant. This is how sports photographers capture sweat falling off of an athlete's face. On the flip side, a slower shutter speed will allow more motion blur into your image. Now, this can be a good thing if it's being used on purpose, or it can be a bad thing if you're shooting with too low of a shutter speed that may lead to a blurry image. There are multiple scenarios when to use a fast shutter speed or a low shutter speed from a visual and a lighting perspective, so let's get into it. Just bring your tripod along. A landscape photographer may use a slower shutter speed with their camera on a tripod, so it restricts all movement on the camera. Because when you're shooting with a slow shutter speed, any camera movement is going to show up in the image because it allows for more motion blur. You may see this with a landscape photographer who's trying to capture a waterfall. The water is moving quickly and roaring, so the slower shutter speed will make it look like it is moving in your image as seen on screen here. An astrophotographer may use a slower shutter speed to allow more light into their camera when it's pitch black outside so they can capture the stars. A street photographer may use a slower shutter speed to capture the hustle and bustle of a city with moving buses and vehicles and bicycles. Regardless of the situation, there's a lot of different artistic approaches that you can take with shutter speed, and there's uses for both slow and fast shutter speeds. The more you practice, the more you'll understand how you can use your own artistic point of view to be able to manipulate your images with the shutter speed. The last setting in the exposure triangle that we're going to cover is ISO, or ISO. Say it however you want, it really doesn't matter. ISO is basically artificial light that your camera creates in order to brighten up your image. While that may sound great, ISO is oftentimes really finicky and will introduce noise into your image really quickly. The majority of cameras nowadays have a very wide range of ISO settings. For example, my Canon R6 Mark II starts at ISO 100 and goes all the way up to 102,400. That's a very big range. Think about it like this. The higher your ISO setting, the more artificial light you'll have and the more noise that you'll have within your image, meaning it's not going to be as tack sharp as you want it. In my camera, oftentimes I see noise being introduced right around ISO 5000, ISO 6400, right in that range. The general recommendation from almost every photographer is to always shoot at ISO 100 when you can to get the crispest, most tack sharp image possible. While this is true, modern cameras and editing softwares have gotten so good that the noise in an image is becoming less and less of an issue. My general rule of thumb is that I always try and shoot at ISO 100 if possible, but I'm not afraid to crank that up if I need to, because I know that on the back end, I'm able to manipulate my photos because I have the experience of doing edits. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that when you're first starting out, but it's good practice to be able to push your camera to its limits and get the absolute most out of it when you need it to. Most cameras also have what's called native ISO. In theory, this is the ISO setting that is where your camera will get the sharpest image possible. In theory is the key word here, because there are a lot of contributing factors to what goes into a sharp image. For example, my Canon R6 Mark II has a native ISO of 400, but let's be honest, I always shoot at ISO 100 when I can and would prefer to do so. Knowing your camera's native ISO is handy information to have in the back of your head when you're shooting, because you have that peace of mind of knowing that you can go higher than ISO 100. Now that you have a basic understanding of the three settings that make up the exposure triangle, let's talk about how you can use them together and my recommendation for which priority order you should set them in when you're out shooting. Each of these three settings work in harmony, and it can be pictured on the exposure triangle. When you adjust one, the other two may need to be adjusted in order for you to keep that perfect exposure. A nice trick for you to utilize when you're exposing an image is the exposure meter at the bottom of your screen or in your viewfinder. When it's right in the middle, that's how you know that your image is properly exposed. Now, what I mean by these all work in harmony is that if you adjust one, it's going to adjust your light, so you need to adjust another. And as we've said, light is measured in stops. So if you have one adjustment to your shutter speed by one stop, you may need to adjust your aperture by one stop. But also understand that this is going to affect some of the visual aspects of your image. If you adjust your aperture, then ultimately you're going to have a different depth of field. So if you don't want your depth of field to change, you may want to bring your shutter speed down and then adjust your ISO accordingly, so you're keeping a level playing field within your camera's exposure. Aperture is typically the setting that I set and think of first. It's important to think through and understand how much of your image you need in focus. Shooting a person is different than shooting a dog, because a dog has a long nose. You may be able to have their eyes in focus, but the tip of their nose won't be in focus. So in that situation, you need a larger aperture so you have more depth of field within your image and can have their entire face be super sharp. Once you set your aperture for how much depth of field you're going to need, next, I recommend setting your shutter speed. Here, it's really important to understand how quickly your subjects are moving. We'll stick with the dog example. A dog, while they may be trained well, dogs move fast, and sometimes they're unpredictable. So typically, I would like to stick with a bit of a higher shutter speed. If you're out and about and shooting outside and you want more action shots, stick with a shutter speed that's more like 1/500 or 1/1000, where you can freeze that action in real time. If you're in a more controlled environment and your dog's trained to sit and stay really well, then you can bring your shutter speed down a little bit to then be able to control how much ISO you're going to need within your image, because the lower your shutter speed, the more light you're allowing into your camera. Always set your ISO last, because you're going to want to keep this as low as possible for the specific scene or setting that you're in. Now that we've covered all three of the settings in the exposure triangle, I want to say that every situation is different, and there are a ton of different nuances in a ton more settings for us to go through. But if you master these three settings, you will set yourself a foundation of success to be able to go out and capture the sharpest images possible. If you found this video helpful, feel free to stick around for a while by subscribing, and don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed. Until next time, go out and use your camera.